Welcome, friend, to this tranquil hour, where we softly unwind the threads of time. Tonight, our tale unfolds in a world distant from our own, yet deeply, achingly human. Whether you're drifting towards sleep or simply seeking to slow the rhythm of your evening, I'm so glad you're here. I'd love to know, where are you listening from? What city or country cradles you tonight, and what hour greets you as you press play? It's wondrous how history can weave connections between strangers. If these gentle, historical whispers bring you solace, consider subscribing. Many more stories await to lull us into the quiet of the night. This is the story of medieval medicina narratives so startling. You may find newfound gratitude for every modern medical marvel we barely notice. From bloodletting that drained life rather than illness to mercury cures that poisoned instead of healed. We'll delve into an era when those sworn to protect life often hastened its end. In this series, we'll uncover the horrifying truths behind medieval treatments. Physicians whose healing claimed more lives than any plague. Why seeking medical help in the Middle Ages was often a death sentence dressed in goodwill. We'll step inside the smoke-choked halls of medieval hospitals, surgical theaters where modern doctors would shudder, a world where superstition wore the mask of science for centuries. But first, a revelation. At the peak of medieval medicine, those who avoided physicians often survived longer. Peasants, too poor for proper care, frequently outlived nobles who could afford the finest medical minds. This was no accident, it was the grim reality of an age when medicine itself was deadlier than the diseases it fought. How could this be? The answer lies in a storm of ignorance, arrogance, and tradition that built medicine on crumbling foundations. Medieval physicians robed in prestige, trained in Europe's grand universities. They quoted ancient texts, spoke in Latin, and seemed divinely wise. Yet beneath this learned facade lurked a fatal flaw, a medical system rooted in fantasy. The core of their practice, the four humours, an ancient Greek theory surviving unchallenged for millennia. It claimed the body held four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health required perfect balance. Illness meant imbalance. In theory, plausible. In practice, catastrophic. A fever, too much blood, drain it. Melancholy, excess black bile, purge it. Every symptom was forced into this rigid mold, even when it defied sense. The true tragedy: physicians doubled down when treatments failed. If bloodletting didn't work, they took more. If purging brought no relief, they prescribed harsher methods. The sicker the patient, the fiercer the cure, a cycle that often ended in graves. But the humors were just the beginning. Medieval medicine brimmed with lethality, mercury miracle cures that slowly poisoned, trepanation drilling skulls to release evil spirits, inviting fatal infections. Enemas of wine, honey and soap administered so relentlessly. Patients died from dehydration. Most shocking, physicians ignored basic hygiene. They moved between patients without washing hands, reused filthy tools, and turned minor procedures into death sentences. Medieval physicians prescribed remedies containing animal dung, convinced that if a substance smelled revolting, it must possess potent healing properties. This stark contrast between theory and practice exposes a chilling truth about human nature. These were not malicious men, intentionally harming their patients. They were educated, well-meaning individuals who genuinely believed they were saving lives. Yet their lethal combination of unwavering confidence and profound ignorance rendered them deadlier than any plague of their era. Take bloodletting, the most widespread and devastating of medieval treatments. Physicians insisted that draining blood restored the body's balance, curing ailments from headaches to heart disease. They sliced veins with knives, applied leeches, or used cupping to suction blood to the surface. The ordeal was brutal, but the volume of blood removed was even more horrifying. 2 to 4 pints per session, often repeated weekly. For context, losing just 1 pint weakens a healthy adult. Multiple pints could trigger shock, organ failure, or death. Yet, as patients grew pale and faint, doctors misinterpreted these signs as proof the treatment was working. A feverish patient collapsing after unconsciousness, harmful humors leaving the body. They mistook fatal blood loss for recovery, often continuing until the patient succumbed to the very cure meant to heal them. The tragedy knew no bounds. Everyone was subjected to bloodletting, the rich and poor, young and old, even pregnant women and newborns. Children's small bodies, drained for common illnesses, rarely survived the treatment. What's more disturbing, The practice persisted centuries, despite overwhelming evidence of its lethality. When patients died, physicians blamed delayed consultations or incurable diseases. This willful denial defined medieval medicine. Mercury rotted patients' jaws. The disease purging, they claimed. Surgical infections killed. Evil spirits or disobedient patients were faulted, never filthy tools or unwashed hands. Medical education only deepened the crisis. Students memorized ancient texts, but learned nothing of anatomy or disease mechanisms. They could recite Galen's theories verbatim, yet couldn't grasp that hand-washing prevented infection. This produced physicians brimming with confidence, but devoid of competence, armed with knowledge that was not just wrong, but fatal. Their training bred arrogance, making them dismissive of alternatives and resistant to change. The bitter irony: those too poor to afford physicians often outlived the wealthy, not because poverty was healthy, but because avoiding treatment meant avoiding harm. In an age ravaged by plague and infection, the healers themselves became agents of death. Hospitals turned into horror chambers, and medicine became a sanctioned slaughter. Yet this is only the beginning of medieval medicine's horrors. Beyond bloodletting lay poisons, mutilations, and superstitions disguised as science. In the coming chapters, we'll uncover how profit and tradition trumped patient welfare. Societies that built cathedrals failed to understand basic biology. Intelligent people clung to deadly beliefs despite evidence. These failures hold a mirror to our era. While we've advanced, the same biases that blinded medieval minds, authority over evidence, tradition over truth, still lurk in modern medicine. Their story is a warning. Certainty without curiosity is the deadliest disease of all. Understanding how healers became killers in the past helps us avoid repeating those mistakes today. As we delve deeper into this dark chapter of medical history, remember that behind every horrific treatment and misguided theory were real people, physicians who truly wanted to help, patients who desperately sought relief, and families who watched loved ones suffer at the hands of those they trusted most. Their stories deserve to be told, not to mock the past, but to honor their suffering and learn from their tragedies. By examining how medicine went so wrong for so long, we gain a deeper appreciation for how far we've come, and a warning against the forces that could lead us astray again. The medieval physician, standing confidently at a patient's bedside, had no idea he was about to become the very thing he sought to fight. He didn't realize his remedies were deadlier than any plague, that his healing touch brought death instead of life, or that his noble profession had become history's most dangerous occupation, not for the practitioner, but for the patient. This is the story of how medicine became murder, how healing turned to harm, and how the people trusted to save us nearly destroyed us. Instead, it's a story that must be told and never forgotten. If you thought the principles of medieval medicine were frightening, wait until you see what happened when physicians actually practiced them. The gap between theory and real-world application turned bad ideas into absolute catastrophes. Imagine you're a medieval physician, fresh from years of studying ancient texts, convinced you understand the human body. A feverish patient arrives, and according to your training, this signals an excess of hot, wet humors. The solution seems obvious: bloodletting to cool and dry them. But here's the reality: you're a patient, likely has an infection, pneumonia, sepsis, or typhoid fever, and their body is already fighting for survival. By draining their blood, you're weakening their immune system and destabilizing their circulation. Yet when they grow pale and faint, you don't see harm, you see success. The excess heat is leaving, you declare, trapped in a lethal loop of confirmation bias. This same deadly logic applied to mercury treatments, used for everything from syphilis to skin conditions. Physicians believed mercury's liquid metal duality gave it magical healing properties. Patients drank it, rubbed it on their skin, or inhaled its vapors. When they developed tremors, drooled excessively, or lost teeth, doctors interpreted these as signs of disease leaving the body, not realizing they were witnessing neurotoxicity. Many might have recovered from their original ailment, but mercury left them with brain damage, kidney failure, or worse. Then there was trepanation, drilling holes into skulls to release evil spirits, or balanced humors. While modern medicine occasionally relieves brain pressure surgically, medieval physicians operated with Stone Age tools, no anesthesia, and zero sterilization. Some skulls show healing, proving survival was possible, but how many died from infection or hemorrhage? We'll never know the true death toll. What's most chilling is that these physicians acted with absolute confidence. A man drilling into a skull believed he was performing cutting-edge medicine. When treatments failed, They rarely questioned their methods instead. A little bloodletting didn't work. Try more. Mercury ointment failed. Switch to drinking it. One hole in the skull wasn't enough. Drill another. Patients spiraled. Weakened by blood loss, dehydrated by poisoned by mercury, each deterioration misinterpreted as healing. By the time they died, physicians blamed late treatment or incurable disease, learning nothing to prevent the next tragedy. This wasn't just primitive medicine, it was a sophisticated system of harm. Patients survived illnesses only to be killed by the cure. The system self-reinforced. Deaths were blamed on weak constitutions. Survivors proved treatments worked. Without the scientific method, empirical evidence, or a culture of skepticism, physicians were trapped in a cycle of theoretical dogma. Families lost loved ones, not to disease, but to its treatments. Women died in childbirth from interventions. Children were bled into lifelong frailty. The dark heart of medieval medicine wasn't just its ignorance, it was the arrogance of certainty. Intelligent, well-meaning healers, trained to prioritize ancient texts over observation, became agents of destruction. Their story is a warning. When authority trumps evidence, and tradition overrides truth, even the noblest professions can become instruments of tragedy. Medieval medicine, with its crude instruments and misguided theories, often proved deadlier than the diseases it claimed to cure. While the four humus theory dominated medical thinking, treatments like bloodletting and primitive surgeries created a chilling paradox. Patients often had better survival odds by avoiding doctors entirely. This foundation of medical malpractice reveals how physicians' unwavering confidence in flawed methods spawned increasingly dangerous interventions. The medieval medical system operated on a fatal principle. When treatments failed, the response was always to intensify them rather than question their validity. This escalation mentality turned minor ailments into death sentences. Physicians trained to see illness through the lens of humoral imbalance would increase bloodletting. When patients weakened, administer higher mercury doses when tremors appeared. Perform more invasive procedures as infections spread. For simple infections, we'd now treat with antibiotics. Medieval doctors prescribed catastrophe. A fever signaled hot, wet humors, demanding blood. As the patient deteriorated from blood loss, the physician would double down, draining more, until the victim either miraculously recovered or more often bled to death. The tools of medieval medicine resembled torture devices. Reused filthy lancets that spread gangrene and infection, cupping vessels that seared flesh while drawing out toxins. Bone saws that turned amputations into death sentences via septic shock. Mercury, that alluring poison, epitomized Vieira's lethal logic. Prescribed for syphilis, melancholy, and even constipation, its effects were horrifically misread. Excessive drooling, toxins, purging, humors. In reality, patients were being slowly, neurologically dismantled, their minds and organs crumbling under heavy metal poisoning. Trepanation showcased medieval medicine's deadly confidence. Doctors drilled skull holes to release evil spirits, causing headaches or madness with no anesthesia, sterile tools, or understanding of brain anatomy. While some skulls show healing, countless others died screaming from infection or brain trauma. Surgery was equally horrifying. Cataracts were treated by shoving the lens deeper into the eye, causing eventual blindness. Kidney stones were extracted through brutal incisions, often fatally severing arteries. Amputations saw limbs hacked off in seconds, with survival relying on luck rather than skill. The pharmaceutical arsenal was a cocktail of toxins, lead, arsenic, and antimony, prescribed for ailments from gout to infertility. Herbal remedies, drowned in lethal concentrations or mixed with poisonous additives. Worst of all, the medical establishment's worship of ancient texts stifled progress. When observations contradicted Galen or Hip, beneficial, accidental discoveries were abandoned if they didn't fit humoral theory. Medical training compounded the crisis. Students memorized ancient texts but rarely touched a living patient. Graduates could debate humors in Latin but couldn't recognize a dying man in front of them. Social and economic forces cemented the harm. Doctors blamed failed treatments on patient disobedience or God's will. Never. Their methods' fees were tied to treatment complexity, incentivizing drawn-out, dangerous therapies over simple cures. The results were catastrophic. Plague victims fared better without bloodletting. Surgical mortality rates 50% from infection. Alone childbirth became deadlier when physicians intervened. The psychological toll was profound. Families watched loved ones suffer under care that accelerated death. breeding generations of medical distrust. Paradoxically, this fear may have saved lives by keeping people from doctors. Medieval medicine's ultimate legacy, a harrowing lesson in how good intentions plus bad science plus institutional arrogance create systems of sanctioned slaughter. Its failures helped spark the scientific revolution, but only after centuries of unnecessary graves. The tools of medieval medicine were as terrifying as they were ineffective. Surgical instruments resembled torture devices more than healing. Tools jagged bone saws hacked through limbs, while patients writhed in agony, held down by assistants on blood-stained tables. Cauterizing irons, glowing red-hot, sealed wounds with the stench of burning flesh. These brutal procedures were performed with no real pain management beyond a gulp of wine or a leather strap to bite. Imagine enduring an amputation fully conscious, feeling the saw's teeth grind through bone, the cilia of muscle as the surgeon worked. Many died not from their original condition, but from shock or trauma. Those who survived the initial horror often succumbed later to infections festering in wounds left by unsterilized tools and filthy hands. No procedure better captured medieval medicine's lethal hubris than trepanation, drilling holes into skulls to release evil spirits. With primitive surgeons bored into brain cavities, causing hemorrhages, brain damage, or instant death. They performed these butchery sessions with absolute confidence, believing themselves pioneers of advanced medicine. The pharmaceutical arsenal was equally deadly. Mercury, now known as a neurotoxin, was prescribed for everything from syphilis to madness. Patients swallowed mercury pills or inhaled its vapors, their bodies slowly poisoning themselves as doctors praised each toxic symptom as healing. Excessive drooling, corrupt humors leaving, tremors, the body fighting, disease, rotten gums, purification in progress. Antimony was molded into everlasting pills patients swallowed and retrieved from their waste to reuse each pass, leaching more toxins into their guts. Lead-based salves treated wounds while silently destroying organs. Apothecaries peddled mythical cures like powdered unicorn horn mixed with mercury, or Thierroc, a universal antidote containing viper flesh, an opium that often killed faster than the poisons it claimed to neutralize. When treatments failed, physicians escalated with fanatical determination. Bloodletting didn't work. Drain more blood. Purgatives failed. Prescribe stronger toxins. This created a death spiral where each intervention pushed patients closer to the grave. The case of King Charles II epitomized this madness. After a minor stroke, his doctors drained 32 ounces of blood in one day, forced him to vomit with arsenically stomatics, packed his bowels with antimony and scalded his scalp with hot irons, fed him crushed human skull and bezel stones. He died not from the stroke, but from this medical onslaught. Medical education cemented the crisis. Students memorized Galen's ancient texts, but never learned anatomy or observed real patients. Graduates emerged armed with lethal confidence, diagnosing humoral imbalances in living bodies. They barely understood. When patients died, physicians blamed fate or weak constitutions, never their methods. Their social status as learned men shielded them from accountability, while profit motives encouraged elaborate, harmful treatments over simple care. The result, a medical system that functioned as a death lottery. Patients who might have recovered naturally were bled, poisoned, and purged into corpses. Seeking help often marked the start of their de-misage intervention, layering new trauma until the body collapsed. This dark era stands as a warning. Medicine divorced from science, scrutiny, and humility becomes weaponized care. Medieval physicians, armed with elegant theories and toxic tools, it didn't just fail to heal, they industrialized suffering in the name of healing. The patient convulsed in unbearable pain as his organs failed one after another. Another heartbreaking entry was made in the physician's ledger life, lost to illness despite the so-called best that medicine had to offer. But this wasn't an outlier, or the mistake of an unskilled doctor. This was standard procedure. Mercury treatments were endorsed by the highest medical authorities and taught in elite universities. Even the famed physician Paracelsus, whose teachings shaped medicine for generations, claimed that the dose makes the poison, failing to recognize that with mercury, there was no safe dose. His followers clung to that belief with near religious zeal, convinced they were delivering advanced medical care. The result, a widespread medical disaster. The mercury crisis wasn't limited to doctors' offices, it seeped into entire communities. Hat makers, mirror workers, and tradesmen exposed to mercury in their work developed symptoms of long-term poisoning. The phrase "mad as a hatter" wasn't metaphor, it described real neurological decline from mercury exposure. Still, even with growing evidence of harm, medical authorities refused to let go of their precious cure. They held on to mercury with the stubbornness of true believers. And in an age where life expectancy was already dismally low, where people constantly battled malnutrition and infection, medicine didn't offer relief. It added another threat. Patients who might have healed on their own were now fighting two battles. One against the illness, and one against the treatment. Visiting a doctor became a deadly risk, where the remedy might be deadlier than the disease. The psychological toll was just as tragic. Imagine realizing your doctor is killing you but unable to stop the treatment, because doing so would mean questioning everything. The wisdom of your healers, the structure of knowledge itself. To keep hope alive, many chose to believe that their suffering had purpose, that pain was simply part of the cure, rather than admit their faith in medicine was misplaced. This tragic episode reveals one of the darkest truths about medieval medicine: its resistance to evidence. Generation after generation, doctors watched patients die after mercury treatments, but they never saw the pattern. They were so wedded to their medical theories, especially the humoral model, that they interpreted every outcome as support for their beliefs. If a patient died, it meant the disease was worse than expected. If they survived, it meant mercury worked. This kind of logic, immune to contradiction, didn't just slow progress, it made healing deadly. Worse still, many of the diseases doctors treated with mercury would have cleared up on their own with rest and basic care. Instead, they applied mercury ointments that made skin conditions worse. Stomach complaints that could have been eased with diet were met with mercury pills that destroyed internal organs. Mental distress, which needed kindness and rest, was answered with mercury vapor that drove people to madness. But mercury wasn't the only threat. Another common and even more deadly treatment was blood. Unlike mercury, which acted swiftly, bloodletting was a slow and steady drain on life. Rooted in ancient Greek humoral theory, it was based on the idea that health depended on a balance between four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease, they believed, came from imbalance, especially too much blood. Doctors misunderstood blood entirely. They didn't see it as the body's essential life force, but just another humor to be regulated. The phlegm, a blade on a handle, was used to slice open veins. The scarificator created dozens of cuts with its spring-loaded blades. Cupping glasses created suction to draw blood through the skin. And then there were leeches used with as much confidence as antibiotics are today. The amount of blood drained would be shocking by modern standards. Medieval doctors routinely removed 1 to 3 pints of blood, enough to weaken even the healthiest patient, and often lethal for the sick. Yet they believed they were offering the best care available, following traditions shaped by centuries of scholarly authority. The true cost of this practice is impossible to fully grasp. Thousands, perhaps millions of people died, not from their illnesses, but from the anemia brought on by blood loss. Others were left vulnerable to new infections. Their weakened bodies couldn't fight. Even when patients visibly worsened after bleeding, the solution was often to bleed them more. The logic was circular and deeply flawed. Tragically, bloodletting was used even in cases where it clearly made things worse. Patients already bleeding from injuries or internal trauma were drained further. Women in childbirth, already losing blood, were bled more under the belief it would ease labor. Children with fevers, tiny bodies fighting to stay alive, were robbed of the blood they needed to survive. Bloodletting, like mercury treatment, persisted because doctors refused to believe the evidence before their eyes. If the patient died, they blamed the illness. If the patient lived, they credited the treatment. This rigid thinking, immune to experience and contradiction, made medieval medicine not just ineffective but fatal. The grim truth is that in the Middle Ages, going to the doctor could be more dangerous than doing nothing at all. Though most physicians truly believed in their craft, their cures often did more harm than good. This tragic contradiction between good intentions and lethal outcomes was rooted in a deep misunderstanding of the body, illness, and healing. And until that foundation was torn down, medicine would continue to do more damage than disease itself. Those lucky enough to survive initial treatments often bore lifelong consequences: neurological damage, kidney failure, and the loss of teeth, all hallmarks of mercury poisoning. And mercury wasn't alone. Lead was another frequent ingredient in medieval remedies, slowly accumulating in patients' bodies. Other metals like arsenic and antimony, now known to be highly toxic, were regularly prescribed, ironically introducing new illnesses without resolving the original complaints. Perhaps the most shocking to modern minds was the practice of trepanation. This involved drilling holes into the skull to release evil spirits or reduce pressure. Based entirely on superstition, surgeons performed the procedure with basic metal tools, no anesthesia, and no knowledge of sterilization. While a few patients survived, many succumbed to infection, blood loss, or direct brain trauma. Still, the procedure was performed with utmost confidence, on par with any other mainstream treatment of the time. Surgery in the medieval world was less a science and more a test of endurance and luck. With only alcohol or crude opiates to dull pain, patients endured horrific suffering. Surgeons hurried to reduce the torment, but their haste often caused serious, sometimes fatal errors. Worse still was the complete lack of hygiene. Tools were reused without cleaning. Blood-covered aprons were worn from one operation to the next. Post-surgical infections were so common they were accepted as a normal step in recovery, rather than a consequence of unclean conditions. The foundation of anatomy that guided these procedures wasn't built on first-hand observation but on ancient texts. Dissections were rare and often forbidden, leaving physicians to rely on outdated Greek and Roman writings riddled with inaccuracies. As a result, treatments were sometimes based on imaginary body structures. Internal injuries were treated according to theoretical frameworks that bore no resemblance to real human biology. Adding to the confusion was the belief in similis, the idea that a cure should mimic the symptom. Yellow flowers were given to treat jaundice, red stones for blood diseases, walnuts for head injuries. This magical thinking, while poetic, led to ineffective and sometimes harmful treatments. The doctrine of signatures also dominated. Physicians believed that God had marked natural objects with clues about their healing properties. A plant with heart-shaped leaves, surely meant to heal the heart. Spotted leaves, a sign they were useful for skin problems. But this symbolic approach distracted physicians from what mattered most: observing how a treatment actually affected the patient. Religious ideology also shaped medicine, often to harmful effect. Illness was frequently seen as divine punishment for sin, leading doctors to prescribe prayer and penance as much as pills. While spiritual rituals could offer comfort, they often delayed critical treatment or replaced it altogether. Simple, treatable conditions were left to worsen while patients underwent religious rites. Challenging any of these norms was dangerous. The medical community fiercely resisted criticism. Those who questioned common practices risked exile from the profession or even charges of heresy. Medical training revolved around memorizing authoritative texts, not observing real patients. Aspiring doctors could study for years without ever laying a hand on the sick. Their knowledge was vast in theory, but frighteningly thin in practice. Perhaps the cruelest twist of all was how failure only reinforced their faith. When patients died after bloodletting, physicians insisted more blood should have been removed. When purging ended in death, they argued the toxins were too deeply rooted. The logic was airtight and utterly broken. Any outcome, no matter how tragic, was used to justify the method. This made medieval medicine terrifying, not just for its ineffectiveness, but because the very people meant to heal became sources of fear. Patients approached treatment with dread, aware that the cure might bring more pain or death. Families had to make impossible decisions: let illness run its course, or place their loved ones in the hands of doctors whose tools might kill them faster than the disease. Ironically, wealth often worsened outcomes. The rich, with access to more doctors and more elaborate treatments, were subjected to a barrage of harmful interventions: repeated aggressive purging, toxic concoctions, and invasive surgeries. The poor, unable to afford medical care, sometimes fared better simply by being left alone to recover naturally. This brutal irony reveals the disconnect between medieval medicine and true healing. Its practices didn't just fail to cure, they often hastened death. What emerged was a system that multiplied suffering, a perfect storm of ignorance, arrogance, and rigid tradition. Healers, despite their intentions, became agents of harm. The long-term lesson of medieval medicine is sobering. It shows how sincere belief, when paired with poor understanding and resistance to change, can build institutions that do far more damage than good. It took centuries of observation, experimentation, and a willingness to challenge old wisdom before medicine began to evolve into a field of actual healing. Take trepanation again, one of the most grotesque examples. Believing mental illness and headaches stemmed from evil spirits or brain pressure, medieval doctors drilled into skulls. No anesthesia existed except a stiff drink or something to bite down on. The agony was unthinkable. Imagine a conscious patient strapped to a wooden table, scalp pulled back, bone exposed. The doctor, confident in his books, begins to grind through the skull slowly, painfully. The noise alone, that awful, wet scraping, would haunt everyone in the room. Many patients died of shock on the table. Others died days later from infection. Yet the practice was celebrated. If the patient died, doctors blamed the disease. If they lived, the treatment was praised, and the tools, they were as horrifying as the procedure. Instruments were reused from one patient to another, never cleaned. Blood, flesh, and pus from earlier surgeries caked the blades. These were ideal environments for bacteria. What we now call sepsis was simply accepted as part of the healing process. Surgeons calmly noted the foul smells and festering wounds, never once connecting the dots between dirty instruments and deadly infections. Kidney stones were another nightmare. The condition caused excruciating pain, but rather than allowing time for the stone to pass naturally, medieval physicians opted for something called cutting for the stone. This involved cutting deep into the bladder or surrounding areas, often through the perineum or rectum, to manually remove the obstruction. Without knowledge of anatomy, this was a bloodbath. Vital vessels were severed, organs punctured. Mortality rates for these procedures hovered near 90%. Still, they were performed again and again. Patients, desperate for relief, were assured this was their best hope, when in truth, it often sealed their fate. Worse still, some procedures were done not to save lives, but for spectacle and study, like live dissection, which we'll explore in the next section. Although human dissection was officially banned by the church, some ambitious physicians found ways around this restriction by disguising their curiosity as treatment. They would cut open living patients under the pretense of surgery, using the opportunity to examine internal organs in real time. Students gathered to hear these findings, even as the patient moaned in agony. Death was not only expected, it was guaranteed. Yet these gruesome displays often boosted the doctor's reputation as a bold and fearless practitioner. Perhaps nowhere is the destructive nature of medieval medicine clearer than in its treatment of wounds. Instead of cleaning injuries and allowing the body to heal naturally, physicians actively introduced filth into the wound. They believed the formation of pus, referred to as laudable pus, was essential to healing. To achieve this, they stuffed wounds with filthy cloth, animal hair, or even human waste, then sealed them up to trap the infection inside. Predictably, this led to gangrene too. Yet physicians saw the foul odor and decay not as failure, but as success. The body was supposedly expelling its poisoned humors. Only when limbs began to fall off or patients succumbed to widespread infection did doctors even consider altering their approach. And even then, the conclusion was often that they had acted too late or not aggressively enough. Childbirth, already life-threatening in the absence of modern obstetrics, became even more deadly when medieval physicians intervened. They blamed difficult labor on the mother's emotional or moral shortcomings, or on imbalanced humors. Their cures included forcing women to drink mercury, using sharp instruments inside the birth canal to induce labor, or performing rudimentary cesarean sections with no understanding of anatomy or infection. When doctors were involved, mortality rates for mothers and babies skyrocketed. Ironically, women attended by traditional midwives without surgical tools or invasive tactics. But for the wealthy, the prestige of having a university-trained physician attend a birth often overrode common sense, with tragic results. Even more disturbing was how children were treated. Medieval physicians saw no reason to adjust treatments based on age. Children were simply considered small adults and subjected to the same brutal procedures. They were bled until unconscious, given enormous doses of mercury that crippled their developing nervous systems, and forced to endure surgeries that would challenge even the strongest adult. A child seizing from mercury toxicity wasn't a red flag, was interpreted as a sign the poison was working. Parents, desperate to save their children, held them down while doctors administered increasingly toxic remedies. The weaker the child became, the more aggressive the treatment. It was a cycle that nearly always ended in death. This physical suffering was matched by emotional trauma. People lived in dread of becoming ill not because of the disease itself, but because treatment often felt like torture. The arrival of a physician, bag of tools in hand, could send patients fleeing in fear. And this fear wasn't irrational, it was learned through centuries of pain. Families had watched their loved ones go into treatment for mild issues, only to emerge mutilated or dead. Medicine had become a source of horror, not healing. So deep was this fear that communities developed elaborate superstitions, home remedies, and spiritual practices all designed to avoid interaction with trained doctors. Yet the medical establishment remained oblivious to this distrust. Each failed treatment was met with more complex justifications blaming the patient's constitution, planetary alignments, or divine will. The possibility that their methods were fundamentally flawed was rarely considered. Even as corpses piled up and patients begged for mercy, the belief in the correctness of their approach remained unshaken. In some places, physicians were feared more than the plague itself. But behind their confidence lay another motivation: money. The economics of medieval medicine fueled the cycle of harm. Physicians charged steep fees for their services. The more dramatic or exotic the treatment, the higher the price. A simple herbal tincture might cost a few pennies, but a bloodletting, surgery, or mercury compound could drain an entire household's resources. To justify these costs, doctors created increasingly elaborate treatment plans convinced that expensive must mean effective. This logic produced a grim marketplace. The wealthy paid the most for treatments that were the most lethal. The poor, unable to afford such care, often lived longer simply because they avoided these so-called cures. The legacy of medieval medicine is a cautionary tale. It shows how dangerous medicine can become when sincere belief is paired with false confidence and an unwillingness to question tradition. Most of these physicians genuinely thought they were helping, but their unshakable trust in flawed theories and their refusal to consider evidence of failure created a system that did more harm than good. It would take centuries of change new knowledge, yes, but also a shift in mindset before healing became medicine's true goal. The idea that physicians should first do no harm had to replace the medieval obsession with dramatic intervention. Only then could the practice of medicine begin to serve the sick rather than compound their suffering. And in looking back on this painful era, we're reminded why modern medicine must never become complacent. The horrors of the past teach us why evidence, ethics, and humility must guide healthcare, not ego or blind tradition. To treat Agnes' melancholy, physicians first turned to powerful emetics, made with toxic substances like antimony and mercury. The goal was to purge the corrupted humors through violent vomiting, cleansing her mind by emptying her stomach. When this produced no improvement, they escalated to blood. Over the course of 3 days, they opened veins in her arms, neck, and even her temples, draining nearly 2 pints of blood in total. They believed that reducing the volume of her humors would restore her mental balance. Instead, Agnes was left faint, pale, and barely responsive. But still, her melancholy lingered. Frustrated by her lack of progress, her physicians turned to increasingly exotic and expensive treatments. They mixed crushed pearls, ground emeralds, and powdered unicorn horn, believing these rare and precious materials could neutralize the mysterious forces afflicting her brain. When that failed, they resorted to using crude metal tools. They drilled a hole through Agnes's skull, just above her temple, hoping to release the evil vapors they imagined were trapped in her mind. There was no anesthesia. The only pain relief Agnes received was a prayer, and perhaps a strong drink. Her screams echoed through the monastery chamber as the iron bit carved into her skull, blood pooling on the floor. The agony was unimaginable. In the following days, her wound became infected, filling with pus and triggering fevers and seizures. But the physicians didn't blame the trepanate. Instead, they saw her worsening symptoms as further evidence that demonic forces had taken hold. In response, they intensified their treatments, prescribing ever more toxic concoctions made with mercury, lead, and arsenic. These poisons pushed Agnes toward death without easing her suffering. 3 weeks later, Agnes died not from her original sorrow, but from blood loss, infection, heavy metal poisoning, and surgical trauma. Her doctors, rather than question their methods, declared her case too far gone for earthly medicine and recommended prayers for her soul. Agnes' tragic story was not rare. Across medieval Europe, those suffering from mental illness endured some of the most brutal treatments imaginable. Superstition, religious dogma, and flawed humoral theories combined to form a deadly approach to psychiatric care. Patients experiencing what we now recognize as mania were restrained with chains, confined in isolation, and subjected to violent interventions meant to rebalance their humors. Doctors believed restricting a patient's movement would allow chaotic fluids to settle inside the body. One chilling treatment involved dunking patients in freezing water, sometimes for long periods. This cold therapy was intended to cool the overheated mind. Many patients died of hypothermia, but their deaths were blamed on the severity of their condition, not the treatment itself. Religious rituals added another layer of cruelty. Exorcisms were routinely prescribed alongside medical procedures. Priests and doctors would work together chanting prayers, depriving the patient of food, and forcing down herbal infusions mixed with holy water. Some of these substances were toxic. The psychological trauma of these rituals often pushed patients further into despair, but to their caretakers, this suffering meant the demons were resisting fighting to stay. Epilepsy, too, was treated with terror and ignorance. Seizures were seen as evidence of possession or an overabundance of phlegmatic humor. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the forced consumption of grotesque substances. Ground human skulls, animal brains, or even the blood of fallen warriors. Some believed the courage and strength of gladiators could be transferred to the sick through their vital essence. When these remedies failed, doctors turned to cauterization, burning the scalp with hot irons to drive out the corrupted energies. The result was horrific third-degree burns, infections, and irreversible damage. But the practice continued for generations. The treatment of children with mental or developmental disabilities was perhaps the most heartbreaking. Conditions like autism or intellectual disability weren't understood and were treated with the same brutality as adult disorders. Children were bled, dosed with mercury, and sometimes trepanned just with smaller tools. Most did not survive. Those who did were often left permanently disabled, not by their original conditions, but by the interventions they endured. What's most disturbing is that medieval physicians documented these treatments in exhaustive detail. They wrote down their methods, ingredients, and outcomes, but consistently failed to recognize the harm they were causing. When patients died, the explanation was always the same. The illness had been too severe, or more aggressive treatment was needed. This blindness to their own role in patients' suffering was supported by the medical theories of the day. Rooted in the writings of Galen and Avicenna, these teachings were rarely questioned. Challenging them meant questioning the entire foundation of medicine, itself a risk few were willing to take in a society that valued obedience over observation. There was also money involved. Wealthy families, desperate to save afflicted loved ones, paid enormous sums for exotic treatments. Physicians, under pressure to deliver results and justify their fees, prescribed ever more extreme procedures. When one intervention failed, they didn't pause to reconsider. They simply escalated, layering remedy upon remedy, each more harmful than the last. Patients were caught in a downward spiral. Each failed treatment led to another. Each worsening symptom was taken as a sign that more aggressive therapy was required. And the more vulnerable the patient or mentally ill, the grieving, the young, the more likely they were to be subjected to these violent and destructive interventions. In the realm of mental health, medieval medicine showed its darkest side. Armed with theories that sounded sophisticated and bolstered by prestigious reputations, physicians inflicted terrible suffering on those least able to resist. Their confidence in their own methods, their refusal to see their own errors, and their loyalty to tradition over evidence created a system that devastated countless lives. Ultimately, the treatment of mental illness during the Middle Ages stands as one of the most chilling reminders of what can happen when belief is allowed to overpower reason, when care becomes cruelty, and when the drive to heal becomes a source of harm. The patients who suffered under these conditions were victims not just of disease, but of a system that had forgotten its most basic duty: to do no harm. Likely weakened by poor nutrition and heavy menstrual bleeding, Agnes de Montfort lay pale and frail as the physician arrived, cloaked in ritual and reverence. He took her pulse with great seriousness, examined her urine held up in a glass flask, and consulted the stars, using astrological charts to determine the perfect timing for her treatment. His diagnosis came swiftly: an overwhelming surplus of corrupt blood, as evidenced by her pallor, ironically seen not as anemia, but as a clear sign of humoral imbalance. The prescribed remedy was obvious: bloodletting, followed by purging. Agnes, already fragile, submitted to having several ounces of blood drawn. Rather than improving, she grew even more pale and weak. But instead of re-evaluating, the physician saw this decline as confirmation. The disease must run deeper than previously thought. More blood was removed. Potent laxatives were administered, causing violent diarrhea and dehydration. Agnes could barely stand, yet her physician assured her family that this was a good sign. The body, he explained, was fighting back. her suffering meant the cure was working. When she collapsed entirely, too weak to lift her head, mercury was prescribed to flush out the remaining toxins. Her gums swelled, her teeth began to loosen, her hair fell out in clumps. Each worsening symptom was viewed as proof of progress, the body purging itself. 3 weeks later, Agnes died. Her body, drained of strength and poisoned by the very treatments meant to heal her, gave out. Her death was recorded not as a failure but a success against a stubborn illness. The physician even praised the family for acting in time, insisting she would have died much sooner without such heroic intervention. Grieving but trusting, her family paid extra for the intensity of care their daughter received. This wasn't medical negligence. This was medieval medicine functioning exactly as intended. A system so locked in its logic, so insulated by theory, that failure could never be acknowledged. Every sign of decline was interpreted as evidence that stronger treatment was needed. Every death was viewed as confirmation that the disease had been too severe. The framework was airtight. If bloodletting didn't help, it meant the patient needed to be bled more or at a more astrologically favorable time. If mercury produced classic signs of poisoning, those signs were reinterpreted as proof the treatment was purging disease from the body. Consider King Henry III of England. Historical records suggest he suffered from kidney stones. His physicians, among the most learned in the kingdom, responded with an arsenal of medieval medicine. They bled him to cool the body, then administered strong purgatives to force the stone out through his bowels. When these failed, they escalated. He was made to drink antimony, a toxic metal thought to possess cleansing powers. When that triggered uncontrollable vomiting and made him even weaker, they were encouraged. The medicine was working. Still in pain, the king was subjected to another remedy, red-hot irons applied to his back. The theory that external pain could distract the body and draw internal pain outward. When the king finally passed the stone naturally weeks later, the physicians took full credit. They claimed their aggressive efforts had loosened the stone. The fact that their interventions nearly killed him didn't matter. He had survived, and therefore, they had succeeded. This dangerous kind of circular reasoning wasn't an outlier, it was the norm. The most respected physicians were often the most extreme. The doctor who never gave up, who always had another treatment ready, who escalated without hesitation, this was the man revered as a master of his craft. Meanwhile, the few who noticed that patients sometimes fared better with less interference were dismissed as timid, ignorant, or lazy. Medieval medicine had created a closed feedback loop. Flawed theories led to harmful treatments, and when those treatments failed, the failure was used to reinforce the original theory. Every sign of decline only deepened physicians' confidence in their methods. This was confirmation bias in its purest and most deadly form, and those who tried to challenge the system silenced or When the Persian physician Al-Razi suggested that some illnesses were best left untreated, his works were banned in European universities. When the Jewish doctor Maimonides proposed that, in many cases, the best medicine was no medicine at all, his ideas were condemned as heretical. Even simple observation, watching what actually happened to patients, was dismissed if it contradicted theory. Doctors who noticed that surgical patients did better when tools were cleaned were told cleanliness was irrelevant. Disease came from within, not from the environment. Midwives, who had better success rates with childbirth than university-trained doctors, were dismissed as superstitious women practicing unscientific folk remedies. The result was a profession completely disconnected from reality. The more a patient suffered, the more certain the physician became that his methods were correct. In this upside-down world, agony was proof of healing, and survival was credit to treatment never. This, tragically, was not medicine gone wrong. It was medicine at its most confident. The intellectual sophistication of medieval medical theory allowed it to justify any degree of human suffering. It could absorb every contradiction, explain away every failure, and silence every voice of dissent. The inability to recognize harm wasn't a side effect of the system, it was the system. And this made it far more dangerous than the diseases it claimed to cure. At least illness, left untreated, might run its course quickly, but under medieval care, a patient could suffer for weeks or months in torment, all while being told they were on the path to recovery. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of it all is that these doctors believed they were helping. They had devoted their lives to studying the great medical texts, mastering the principles of their craft, and delivering what they truly thought was healing. They didn't see themselves as executioners but as saviors. The tragedy of medieval medicine wasn't rooted in malice or neglect. It wasn't a failure of effort or lack of care. The physicians of the time often worked with dedication and sincerity. That humility, the willingness to admit uncertainty, to recommend the gentlest path first, to hold back rather than push forward recklessly is one of the greatest triumphs of modern medical practice. It is a kind of wisdom that medieval medicine, for all its complexity and learning, never achieved. But their good intentions only deepened the harm because they operated within a system so deeply flawed that even the most diligent efforts often led to suffering and death. The next time you visit a modern doctor who says, "Let's wait and see," or who advises against immediate intervention, consider how far medicine has come. Medieval medical manuals were filled with complicated explanations for failure, but none that questioned the treatment itself. If bleeding didn't work, perhaps it was done at the wrong hour. Infections after surgery, evidence of internal imbalance, not unclean tools. Physicians who hesitated or admitted uncertainty were often seen as unqualified. Families desperate for hope sought out the most assertive, confident doctors, those who proposed bold and complex treatments. The ones who said do less were dismissed as lazy or ignorant. To question their methods was not merely to challenge science, it was to flirt with heresy. The same forces that burned heretics for challenging religious dogma protected physicians from scrutiny, even when their treatments led to mass suffering. New methods threatened not just individuals, but entire institutions. Innovation was often viewed not as progress, but as an insult to generations of tradition. As a result, even obviously harmful practices persisted for centuries without challenge. The tendency to value action over observation, the belief that expensive means effective, the reluctance to admit uncertainty, these shadows of medieval medicine still linger in modern healthcare. They truly believed they were helping, but their training, their tools, and their worldview blinded them to the truth. But by studying the failures of the past, we can better recognize the warning signs in the present. This dynamic pushed medicine toward more aggressive, more dangerous practices. Medieval medicine was costly. It reminds us that credentials, complexity, and conviction are not enough. Without honest observation, critical self-reflection, and the humility to admit we might be wrong, medicine can easily become a source of harm rather than healing. And the more complex the treatment, disease was seen as an enemy to be attacked with force, not a condition to be understood or carefully managed. Rest and observation were seen as weak. Intervention, no matter how brutal, was always better. The idea that sometimes the best treatment is none at all was unthinkable. This system succeeded in convincing everyone, patients and doctors alike, that suffering was essential to healing. Religious authority, social trust, financial incentives, and educational reinforcement all working in sync, medieval medicine became a self-sustaining machine, one that could continue indefinitely, no matter how many lives it ruined. Pain, nausea, weakness, these weren't side effects. They were signs the cure was working. People came to believe that the more a treatment hurt, the more powerful it must be. This mindset didn't just justify extreme measures, it made them desirable. The higher the fee, but an elaborate purging regimen, a bloodletting session timed with the stars, or a chemical preparation involving imported substances could cost a fortune. The logic was seductive. If something costs more, surely it must work better. This belief helped justify increasingly dangerous intervention. Doctors simply couldn't conceive of the idea that they might be the source of their patients' suffering. If mercury caused suffering, it meant the body was deeply corrupted. If herbs failed, perhaps spirits had interfered. Every theory reinforced itself, and no result ever prompted a true re-evaluation. They were not taught to observe patients carefully or question what they saw. Instead, they were trained to fit every symptom into the framework of humors and planets, and to argue from ancient authority. This produced doctors who were intellectually impressive but often devastating in practice. The core problem with medieval medicine wasn't simply the use of outdated theories or dangerous treatments. Instead, treatments were layered: herbal tonics first, then bloodletting, then purging, followed by surgical procedures or chemical applications. Each step was seen as a necessary next move, when the previous one didn't go far enough. But with no understanding of iatrogenic harm caused by medical treatment itself, doctors never realized they were the ones doing the damage. It was the creation of a system so self-assured, so impervious to feedback, that failure itself became a form of validation. When a patient died after bloodletting, it wasn't seen as a reason to reconsider the practice. Instead, physicians assumed they hadn't bled the patient enough. If mercury poisoned the body, it was a sign the patient needed more of it, not less. If a trepanation failed to relieve madness, the conclusion was that the drill hadn't gone deep enough. This wasn't just stubbornness, it was an intellectual architecture built to resist doubt. Every outcome, no matter how tragic, could be explained in a way that preserved the core assumptions. If a patient recovered, the treatment had worked. If they worsened, the disease must have been unusually severe, or the intervention not aggressive enough. Consider King John of England, who died in 1216 after reportedly consuming too many peaches and cider. Modern historians suspect dysentery. His physicians, however, diagnosed an excess of heat in his system. Their solution, bloodletting and purging. When those treatments made him sicker, it only reinforced their belief that the humors were dangerously imbalanced. Their response was to intensify treatment, not question it. This created what we would now call a closed epistemic loop-sealed way of thinking where contradictory evidence couldn't penetrate. One of the most dangerous consequences of this system was the escalation of harm. Physicians rarely stopped after a single failed intervention. When patients grew weaker, it was blamed on the disease, not the remedies. And the structure of society ensured this harmful logic endured. Medical training reinforced the problem. Students spent years immersed in theory, memorizing texts, mastering logic, and learning how to justify every outcome. Religious institutions further shielded medicine from criticism. Doctors were seen as vessels of divine knowledge. Economics played a role too. Professional guilds and hierarchies also resisted change, worst of all, with theoretical certainty, and the damage went far beyond physical treatments. It extended to how illness itself was understood. The consequences of this way of thinking still echo today. Medieval doctors weren't evil. They were educated, well-intentioned professionals operating in a system that rewarded confidence over caution. The story of medieval medicine is not just a historical curiosity. It's a cautionary tale. The tragedy of medieval medicine, both for the physicians and their patients, wasn't a result of cruelty or neglect, but of a system that rewarded confidence over correctness. In a world where appearing sure was valued more than being right, healing became an illusion. This is what made medieval medicine more dangerous than disease itself. It took the deeply human desire to help and transformed it into a finely tuned engine of suffering, protected by tradition, authority, and the comforting power of belief. This convergence of harmful practices created a perfect storm of medical catastrophe woven into daily life. Imagine being a 14th century peasant, already weakened by poor diet and hard labor. You fall ill with a fever, likely caused by spoiled food or contaminated water. Your worried family summons the local healer, hoping to save you. What follows is a nightmare masquerading as care. The physician begins with blood. Your fever is seen as a sign of excessive hot humors, so your veins are opened with a dull, rusty blade. Bowl after bowl fills with your blood, leaving you weak and breathless. But to the doctor, this is only the beginning. Next comes purging. You're forced to swallow a syrup laced with mercurous substance that strips your body from the inside out. Diarrhea drains what little strength remains. Every retch, every tremor, is seen as progress. The treatment is working, but you're still sick. So now, the skull must be opened. A crude trepanation drill bites into your head. You're restrained and screaming as the tool grinds through bone. The physician leans over the gaping wound, declaring he's releasing the evil vapors plaguing your mind. Infection seeps in immediately, but no one recognizes it. Your surroundings offer no relief. The instruments used on you were last employed on a plague victim, wiped with a filthy rag but never sterilized. The same bloodied apron, the same pus-stained hands, move from patient to patient. The stench of death hangs in the air. This is not a place of healing, it's a breeding ground for disease. Perhaps worst of all is the psychological pain. You're told your agony is a necessary step toward recovery. When you cry out, you're scolded for your weakness. Your family clings to the physician's words, desperate to believe this horror has purpose. And as you suffer, your family suffers too. Every treatment carries a cost. The bloodletting, the purging, the surgeries. Each procedure drains their savings while draining your life. They pawn belongings, go into debt, and sacrifice everything in the belief that these expensive treatments offer hope. Meanwhile, the physician grows richer, his confidence unshaken. This wasn't a system struggling to do better, it was a system functioning exactly as intended. Medical guilds protected practitioners from criticism, forming tight circles of mutual reinforcement. To question established practices wasn't just frowned upon, it was heresy. Consider the imagined case of Master Geoffrey, a physician in Paris during the Black Death. Each day he administers bloodletting, mercury, purging. and surgery. Each day, his patients die. But Jeffrey doesn't question his methods. He blames the stars, the patient's sin, the severity of the plague. His medical education has trained him not to observe outcomes, but to defend theories. Every failure has a ready-made explanation, none of which requires self. The university system that produced Jeffrey and countless others was not built to produce innovators. It was built to reproduce authority. Students memorized ancient texts, mastered logical frameworks, and repeated the same formulas. They were trained to treat illness as a mechanical puzzle to be solved using the tools of their ancestors, not to observe, question, or adapt. The church only deepened this rigidity. Illness was seen as divine punishment. Death, then, was not. Failure, it was judgment. The physician was a spiritual guide as much as a healer, and outcomes were placed in the hands of God. This provided a perfect shield from accountability. If a patient died, the heavens had spoken. So it was that the system developed complex, airtight defenses against reality. Every death could be attributed to anything but the treatment itself. The stars, the patient's temperament, the lateness of intervention, the will of God, the core ideas were never touched. Another flaw was what we might call the intervention cascade. Once a physician began treatment, there was no stepping back. If bloodletting failed, more blood must be drawn. If purging failed, stronger palliatives were given. If mercury failed, the dose was increased. This escalation turned minor illnesses into death sentences. The very act of trying to help became the mechanism of destruction. With no practice of controlled observation, physicians had no way to separate causation from coincidence. If a patient recovered, the treatment got credit if earned. If healing had nothing to do with it, if they died, external forces were blamed. This selective thinking made harmful practices appear effective to those performing them. Over time, this illusion became a kind of therapeutic nihilism in disguise. Physicians didn't have real cures for most conditions, but they filled that void with aggressive treatments that looked impressive. The more violent the procedure, the more serious it seemed. And so the brutality of medieval medicine was often mistaken for competence. Tragically, these treatments often disrupted the very healing the body might have achieved on its own. A fever that could have passed became deadly after bloodletting and mercury. A wound that might have healed cleanly turned septic under a dirty scalpel. The body's natural resilience was undermined by interventions it couldn't survive. And layered on top of this was the financial incentive. Doctors were paid for doing, not succeeding. Complicated procedures fetched high fees. Watching, waiting, or simply offering comfort didn't. So more was always done regardless of the risk. The most authoritative, confident physicians were the most dangerous. The ones who expressed doubt, who advocated restraint, were dismissed as weak or unskilled. The system rewarded unwavering belief over careful humility. And so, the more harm a doctor caused, the more respected he often became. When we step back and view the whole picture, what we see is not isolated failure but systemic collapse. From its flawed theoretical foundations, to its destructive treatments, to the institutions that protected it all, medieval medicine was a catastrophe in motion. But its legacy lives on. It reminds us how easily tradition, ego, money, and fear can keep dangerous practices alive even in the face of mounting evidence. It warns us of the risks when institutions place authority above accountability. It teaches that healing requires more than knowledge, requires the humility to admit what we don't know. The medieval physician, confident in his theory and praised by his peers, too often became an agent of death rather than health. Not out of cruelty, but because he was trapped in a system that told him he was doing the right thing, even as his patients died at his feet. In the end, medieval medicine's greatest failure wasn't just in what it did, it was in what it believed. It believed that confidence was proof of truth, that complexity was proof of competence, that pain was proof of healing. And it believed all of that so deeply that it could not see what was right in front of it, that the cure had become worse than the disease. The story of medieval medicine, in the end, is a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when authority goes unchecked, when tradition outweighs evidence, and when the appearance of knowledge is valued more than its substance. It reminds us that true healing begins not with certainty, but with curiosity. That medical systems must be built not to protect status or theory, but to serve the patient. It's easy to look back with judgment, but the true horror of medieval medicine wasn't the use of leeches or mercury, it was the utter absence of what we now recognize as the scientific method. Physicians didn't question, They didn't test. They didn't observe and revise. They memorized. They obeyed. And when things went wrong, they explained it away. Medical education in the Middle Ages was rooted in reverence, not inquiry. Aspiring doctors didn't study real anatomy through dissection. They didn't gather data from real patients. Instead, they committed to memory the ancient writings of Galen, Hippocrates, and other long-dead authorities. These texts, some more than 1,000 years old, were treated as sacred truth, not as hypotheses to be examined, challenged, or improved. This created a system built to preserve itself. When reality clashed with doctrine, it was reality that was dismissed. New observations were threats. Questions were risks. A physician who dared to suggest that a revered authority might be wrong could find himself branded a heretic or a fraud. And so, medicine stagnated, while other parts of human knowledge like engineering, art, or philosophy slowly advanced through trial and error. Medicine remained frozen in time. Treatments that harmed more than they helped continued for generations, because they had the weight of tradition behind them. Theories disconnected from biological reality became the foundation of medical practice, not because they worked, but because they were old and complex. Worse still, medieval medicine lacked anything resembling systematic research. Physicians didn't perform controlled experiments. They didn't keep detailed records of what worked and what didn't. They didn't test variables or search for patterns. Instead, they relied on anecdote, superstition, and the words of the ancients. If a patient recovered after a treatment, that was proof the treatment had worked. Divinate. If the patient died, the physician blamed divine will, the patient's weak constitution, or the severity of the illness, never the treatment itself. This mindset, driven by confirmation bias, allowed harmful practices to thrive. Treatments continued not because they were effective, but because failure was never allowed to count against them. Physicians made logical leaps based on superficial patterns. If two symptoms appeared together, they must be related. If two patients responded differently, the theory still held. It was simply adjusted to accommodate the outcome. The theory of the four humors is a prime example. It was based on the simple observation that the human body produces fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. But from this modest observation, an entire worldview was constructed, one that dictated diagnosis and treatment for over a millennium. It didn't matter that this theory was biologically inaccurate. What mattered was that it was neat, ancient, and could explain everything if only you added enough complexity. This intellectual rigidity was enforced not just by ideas, but by institutions. Medical guilds controlled who could practice and how. They protected their members from criticism and competition. Conformity brought career success. Innovation brought suspicion. Young doctors learned quickly that challenging accepted methods would not earn them praise but ruin. There were powerful economic reasons for this too. Physicians had invested years in mastering traditional methods. Their income and status depended on maintaining those methods. Admitting they were flawed would mean admitting that their training, their expertise, and their identity were built on error. And so it was easier to keep doing harm than to acknowledge a mistake. Even in the face of obvious failure, the system had answers. If bloodletting didn't help, the timing must have been wrong. If mercury poisoned the patient, the dose wasn't high enough. If nothing worked, then clearly the patient was beyond saving, or perhaps it was the will of God. This habit of rationalizing failure, rather than learning from it, became one of the most enduring features of medieval medicine. Each generation inherited the same ideas, added new layers of theory, and passed it on more rigid and harder to challenge than ever. And when reformers eventually emerged, they were met with resistance. New ideas weren't welcomed. They were attacked. The introduction of anatomical study, evidence-based observation, and early forms of the scientific method were seen as threats, not progress. Reformers were branded as dangerous heretics, their reputations ruined for daring to suggest that the old ways were wrong. This resistance was deeply tragic, not because medieval physicians lacked intelligence, but because they were trapped in a system that punished curiosity and rewarded conformity. Many were brilliant minds who, under different circumstances, could have made enormous contributions to human health, but they were taught not to question, and so they didn't, and in their wake, countless lives were lost, not because medicine couldn't help but because it refused to learn, because it clung to authority over evidence, dogma over data, and pride over humility. folk remedies that actually worked were dismissed as peasant superstition. Meanwhile, elaborate but ineffective rituals were elevated to the status of science. What mattered was not whether something healed, but whether it came from a respected source. The result was the more invested a physician became in the system that elevated him, the harder he worked to protect it regardless of whether it actually worked. This created a deeply hierarchical structure in medieval medicine, where those with the most prestige were often the ones most committed to preserving practices that harmed their patients. Their influence wasn't built on results, but on their command of abstract theory and their place within the medical elite. The result was a medical system filled with contradictions. It was intellectually advanced yet practically backward, steeped in learning but devoid of wisdom, confident in its abilities yet tragically ineffective. Medieval doctors could articulate elaborate theories about the balance of humors and planetary alignments with great authority yet remained blind to the fact that their treatments were killing people. As we reflect on this grim chapter in medical history, it's essential to recognize that these physicians were not villains or frauds. They were, by and large, sincere practitioners doing what they believed was right. The tragedy wasn't their lack of effort, it was the rigid system around them that prevented them from seeing the harm they caused. They were trapped in a framework that prized tradition over evidence, authority over observation, and pride over progress. This is what makes the story of medieval medicine such a powerful warning. It teaches us the value of scientific skepticism, the importance of observation, and the need for institutions that are designed to evolve rather than entrench. It reveals how even well-meaning healers can become agents of harm when they work within a system that cannot question itself. Today, we benefit from a radically different approach. Modern medicine is grounded in research, data, experimentation, and review. Treatments are tested. Failures lead to improvements, not rationalizations. But this progress wasn't inevitable, it was hard-won. The transformation from superstition to science required far more than new knowledge. It required a fundamental rethinking of how knowledge was created, tested, and shared. It required the birth of the scientific method, the rise of evidence-based practices, and the development of institutions that valued results over rank. And it required something else, something harder to measure but just as vital. A cultural shift. A shift away from certainty and status, and toward humility and continuous learning. The greatest strength of modern medicine is not how much it knows, but how rigorously it questions what it thinks it knows. By contrast, medieval medicine's most devastating flaw was its inability to recognize its own limitations. It never asked, what if we're wrong? And so it could never truly improve. Today, that self-correction is baked into the system. Through peer review, clinical trials, and ongoing research, modern medicine is built to refine itself. It isn't perfect, but it is designed to become better. And that design is what separates healing from harm. Yet the dangers of the past are not entirely behind us. The same forces that upheld medieval medicine, ego, financial incentive, blind faith in authority, can still appear in modern forms. That's why the lessons of the Middle Ages remain so vital. They remind us that good intentions are not enough, that credentials and confidence do not guarantee that every established practice must remain open to question, and that the heart of medicine must always be the patient, not the theory, not the institution, not the pride of the practitioner. The physicians of medieval Europe were trapped in a system that obscured the truth. Our responsibility is to ensure that we are not, that our current knowledge does not become dogma, that our systems remain transparent, and that our commitment to healing never loses sight of its purpose. Ultimately, the story of medieval medicine is more than a cautionary tale, it's also a testament to how far we've come. It shows us the cost of unchallenged assumptions, but also the potential of science, compassion, and humility to build something better. The patients who suffered at the hands of medieval doctors didn't die in vain. If their experience helps us avoid similar mistakes, their pain becomes a legacy, one that urges us to do better, be better, and never lose sight of the fundamental promise of medicine: to help, to heal, and above all, to do no harm.